I work as a delivery driver for a small courier company. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. I usually don't mind working late, but something about Christmas Eve deliveries always felt off. Maybe it's the emptiness of the streets or the way everything seems unnaturally quiet, like the world's holding its breath. That night, I got a call just as my shift was ending. A last-minute request came through for a package pickup. The address was on the outskirts of town, in an area I didn't recognize. I considered passing it off, but my manager begged me to take it. "It's a big tip," he promised. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The GPS led me down narrow, snow-covered roads that seemed to stretch on forever. I passed darkened houses, their windows glowing faintly with Christmas lights. But the further I drove, the fewer houses there were. Finally, I arrived at the address, a dilapidated old house at the end of a dead-end street. It looked like no one had lived there in years. The porch lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the snow. As I stepped out of the van, I heard the crunch of footsteps. A man emerged from the side of the house wearing a red Santa suit. His beard was unkempt, and his face was partially hidden by the hood. He was carrying a large, lumpy sack slung over his shoulder. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I stayed professional. "You're here for the delivery?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Without waiting for a reply, he shoved the sack into my hands. It was heavier than I expected, and I thought I felt something shift inside. "Deliver this by midnight," he said, "and whatever you do, do not open it, no matter what you hear." His grin stretched a little too wide, and his eyes, they didn't look right. They were dull, almost lifeless. I nodded quickly, just wanting to leave. As I loaded the sack into the van and glanced back, he was gone. Not walking away, just gone. The delivery address wasn't far, but the GPS started acting up, recalculating and sending me down unfamiliar roads. The radio cut out, replaced by static, and the interior of the van felt colder than it should have, even with the heat blasting. That's when I heard it, a faint, scratching sound from the back. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the sack was just sitting there, motionless. Probably just shifting around, I muttered to myself, trying to stay calm. The scratching grew louder. Then I heard a faint whisper. It was muffled, but unmistakable. "Let me out." I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I turned to look at the sack. It was still, silent. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't bring myself to start driving again. Then the sack shifted, just a little, enough to make my stomach drop. I grabbed my phone and called my manager. No signal, of course. I considered opening the sack, just to see what was inside, but his warning echoed in my head. "Do not open it, no matter what you hear." Taking a deep breath, I started driving again. The road grew darker, the trees closing in around me. The GPS recalculated again, this time leading me down a narrow, snow-covered trail. The whispers started up again, louder now. "Please, help me," they begged. "Let me out." My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel. Finally, the trail ended at a small abandoned chapel, deep in the woods. The windows glowed with an unnatural red light, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't want to go in, but I knew I couldn't leave the sack in the van. Gathering all the courage I had, I grabbed it and approached the door. It creaked open before I could knock, revealing a single wooden chair in the center of the room, illuminated by a flickering chandelier. The whispers stopped as soon as I stepped inside. The air was ice cold, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. I placed the sack on the chair and stepped back, my breathing heavy. The chapel was silent, but something about the stillness made my skin crawl. The red glow from the chandelier flickered faintly, casting distorted shadows on the walls. That's when I saw him. The man in the Santa suit was standing in the far corner of the room, motionless. He hadn't been there when I came in. I was sure of it. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his outline. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders unnaturally broad. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring. My gut screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt like lead. "I delivered your package," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm leaving now." He tilted his head slightly, as if he was studying me, but still didn't move. The silence grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard. Though neither of us had moved, the sound was coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. When I looked back toward the Santa, he was closer now, just a few feet away. I bolted for the door, my boots slipping on the icy stone floor. The air outside was freezing, but I barely noticed as I sprinted toward the van. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open. I jumped in, slammed it shut, and started the engine. The headlights flickered to life, illuminating the trail ahead. Just as I was about to pull away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing at the edge of the chapel steps, watching me. His figure was barely visible in the faint red glow behind him, but I could feel his gaze, even through the darkness. The road back was worse than the trip there. The GPS glitched out completely, leaving me guessing at every turn. At one point, the van got stuck in the snow, and it took what felt like forever to get it moving again. The entire time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to be standing there. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The van was silent now, but the unease lingered. I glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, but it felt like someone was sitting there, watching me. I don't know what was in that sack, and I don't want to know. All I know is I'll never take another late-night delivery again.